literature. That's what we're here to do. We're not here to take this stuff too seriously, but my goodness, we got some really dope social commentary, very thinly veiled in the form of a narrative called Oliver Twist. As I am about two-thirds of the way through with reading, that this is my first time actually reading all the way through with everybody here present. Actually, is the first time reading this all the way through. So, since I see a couple people are here already, I'm going to go ahead and dive right in. Uh, Chapter 34 contains some introductory particulars relative to a young gentleman who now arrives upon the scene and a new adventure which happened to Oliver. It was almost too much happiness to bear. Oliver felt stunned and stupefied by the unexpected intelligence. He could not weep or speak or rest. He was scarcely the power of understanding anything that had passed until after a long ramble in the quiet evening air, a burst of tears came to his relief, and he seemed to awaken all at once to a full sense of the joyful change that had occurred, and the almost insupportable load of anguish which had been taken from his breast. The night was fast closing in when he returned homewards laden with flowers which he had culled with peculiar care for the adornment of a sick chamber. As he walked briskly along the road, he heard behind him the noise of some vehicle approaching at a furious pace. Looking around, he saw that it was post chassis driven. "Is it you, Gates?" cried Oliver, running up to the chassis door. Giles popped out his nightcap again preparatory to making some reply, when he was suddenly pulled back by a young gentleman who occupied the other corner of the chassis, and who eagerly demanded what was the news.
"In a word," cried the gentleman, "better or worse?"
"Better, much better," replied Oliver hastily.
"Oh, thank heaven!" exclaimed the gentleman. "You are sure?"
"Quite sure," replied Oliver. "The change took place only a few hours ago, and Mr. Losberne says that all of the danger is at an end." The gentleman said not another word, but opening the chassis door, leaped out, and taking Oliver hurriedly by the arm, led him aside.
"You are quite certain there is no possibility of any mistake on your part, my boy, is there?"
demanded the gentleman in a tremulous voice.
"Pray do not deceive me by awakening any hopes that are not to be fulfilled."
"I would not for a word, sir," replied Oliver. "Indeed, you may believe me. Mr. Losberne's words were that she would live to bless us all for many years to come. I heard him say so." The tears stood in Oliver's eyes as he recalled the scene which was the beginning of so much happiness, and the gentleman turned his face away and remained silent for some minutes. Oliver thought he heard him sob more than once, but he feared to interrupt him by any further remark, for he could well guess what his feelings were, and so stood apart, feigning to be occupied with his nosegay. All this time, Mr. Giles, with the white nightcap on, had been sitting up on the steps of the chassis, supporting an elbow on each knee, and wiping his eyes with a blue cotton pocket handkerchief dotted with white spots. That the honest fellow had not been feigning emotion was abundantly demonstrated by the very red eyes which he regarded the young gentleman, which he turned round and addressed him.
"I think you had better go on to my mother's in the chaise, Giles," said he. "I would rather walk slowly on so as to gain a little time before I see her. You could say I'm coming." "Oh, I beg your pardon, Mr. Harry,"
said Giles, giving a final polish to his ruffled countenance with the handkerchief.
"but you would have leave the postboy to say that. I should say very much obliged to you. It wouldn't be proper for the maids to see me in this state, sir. I should never have any more authority with them than I did.
Well, rejoined Mr. Harry Maylie, smiling,
You can do as you like. Let him go on with the luggage if you wish, and do follow with us. Only first exchange the nightcap for some more appropriate covering, or we shall be taken for madmen.
2 seconds. Mr. Giles, reminded of his unbecoming costume, snatched off and pocketed his nightcap, and substituted a hat of grave and sober shape, which he took out of the chaise. This done, the postboy drove off, and Giles, Mr. Maylie, and Oliver followed at their leisure. As they walked along, Oliver glanced from time to time with much interest and curiosity at the newcomer. He seemed about 25 years of age, and was of middle height. His countenance was frank and handsome, and his demeanour singularly easy and prepossessing. Notwithstanding the difference between youth and age, he bore so strong a likeness to the old lady that Oliver would have had no great difficulty in imagining their relationship, even if he had already spoken of her as his mother. Mrs. Maylie was anxiously waiting to receive her son, when she reached the cottage, and the meeting did not take place without great emotion on both sides.
"Oh, mother," whispered the young man, "why did you not write me before?"
"I did," replied Mrs. Maylie, "but on reflection I determined to keep back the letter until I heard Mr. Losburn's opinion."
"But why," said the young man, "why run the chance of that occurring which so nearly happened? If Rose had, I cannot even utter the word now, if this illness had terminated differently, how could you have ever forgiven yourself? How could I have ever known happiness again?" "If it had been the case, Harry," said Mrs. Maylie, "I fear your happiness would have been effectually blighted, and that your arrival here a day sooner or later would have been of very, very little import."
"And who can wonder if it be so, mother?" rejoined the young man. "Or why should I say if? It is, you know it, mother, you must know it."
"I know that she deserves the best and purest love the heart of a man can offer,"
said Mrs. Maylie.
"I know that devotion and affection of her nature require no ordinary return, but one that shall be deep and lasting. If I did not do this, and now besides that a changed behavior in one she loved would break her heart, I should not feel my task so difficult of performance, or have to encounter so many struggles in my own dirty bosom, which I take what seems to be me the strict line of duty."
"That is unkind, mother," said Harry. "Do you still suppose that I am a boy ignorant of my own mind, and mistaking the impulses of my own soul?"
"Justified become only more fleeting.
"Above all, I think," said the lady, fixing her eyes on her son's face,
"that if an enthusiastic, ardent, and ambitious young man marry a wife whose name there is a stain, which, though it originate in no fault of hers, may be visited by the cold and sordid people upon her, and upon his children also, and in exact proportion to his success in the world, be cast in his teeth and made a subject of sneers against him, he may, no matter how good and how generous in his nature, one day repent of the connection he formed in early life, and she may have pain and torture of knowing that he does so."
"Ah, mother," said the young man impatiently, He would be a selfish brute, unworthy alike of the name of man and of the woman you describe who acted thus.
You think so now, Harry,
Replied his mother. And ever will, said the young man. The mental agony I have suffered during these last 2 days wrings from me an undisguised avowal to you of a passion which, as you well know, is not one of yesterday, nor one I have lightly formed. On Rose, sweet, gentle girl, my heart is set as firmly as ever the heart of a man was set upon a woman. I have no thought, no view, no hope in life beyond her. And if you oppose me in this great stake, you take my peace and happiness in your hands and cast them to the wind. Mother, think better of this, and of me, and do not disregard the happiness of which you seem to think so little.
Harry,
Said Mrs. Maylie.
it is because I think so much of warm and sensitive hearts that I would spare them from being wounded. But we have said enough, and more than enough on this matter just now.
Let it rest with Rose, then, interposed Harry. You will not press these overstained questions of yours so far as to throw any obstacle in my way.
I will not,
Rejoined Mrs. Maylie,
but I will have you consider.
I have considered, was the impatient reply. Mother, I have considered. Years and years I have considered ever since I have been capable of serious reflection. My feelings remain unchanged as they ever will. And why should I suffer the pain of a delay in giving them vent which can be productive of no earthly good? No, before I leave this place, Rose shall hear me.
She shall,
Said Mrs. Maylie. There is something in your manner which would almost imply that she would hear me coldly, mother, said the young man.
not coldly,
Rejoined the old lady.
far from it.
How then? Urged the young man. She has formed no other attachment.
Oh, no, indeed,
Replied his mother.
you have, or I mistake, too strong a hold on her affections already. What would I say?
Resumed the old lady, stopping her son as he was about to speak.
Is this, before you stake your all on this chance, before you suffer yourself to be carried to the highest point of hope, reflect for a few moments, my dear, on Rose's history, and consider what effect the knowledge of her doubtful birth may have on her decision. Devoted as she is to us, with all the intensity of her noble mind, and with that perfect sacrifice of self which, in all matters great or trifling, has always been her characteristic.
And what do you mean?
That I leave you to discover,
Said Mrs. Maylie.
I must go back to her. God bless you.
I shall see you again tonight? Asked the young man eagerly.
By and by,
Replied the lady.
when I leave Rose.
You will tell her I am here? Said Harry.
Of course,
Replied Mrs. Maylie. And say how anxious I have been, and how much I have suffered, and how I long to see her. You will not refuse to do this, mother?
no,
Said the old lady.
I will tell her all.
And pressing her son's hand affectionately, she hastened from the room. Mr. Losberne and Oliver had remained at another end of the apartment while this hurried conversation was proceeding. The former now held out his hand to Harry Maylie, and hearty salutations were exchanged between them. The doctor then communicated, in reply to his multifarious questions from his young friend, the precise account of his patient's situation, which was quite as consolatory and full of promise as Oliver's statement had encouraged him to hope, and the whole of which Mr. Giles, who affected to be busy about the luggage, listened with greedy ears. Jamie Tomlin's back. Nice to see you there, man. I hope everything's going great with you and Fishy. A quick break while I look you up so I can sub to you, because if you're back twice, you might have actually subbed to me. So let's see. I couldn't find you when I just searched you the other day, so, or I guess last night was really what I meant by that, but oh, come on, highlights. Here we go. Copy. I have some cool historical facts for everybody when I am done with this chapter. I've got my first fact already pulled up just because I had to double check on her name. But people who don't know me, I'm a huge history nut. So it makes a lot of fun. But again, huge shout outs to Against the World G, Chris the Fresh, Fishy Fishy, Dog Rose, and Don't Watch Continue, who all keep showing up for these. Huge shout outs to Zymer Beats, Tom, and Linfamy, who are all like really big, awesome channels that have actually stopped by and viewed a couple of these. And of course, big shout out to the kid from last night who subbed, and big shout out to Jamie, who I'm still not 100% sure on the pronunciation of your last name there, but I'm definitely happy to have you here. You'll give me like 2 seconds to search, because it still is just now pulling up another tab with YouTube on it. And I am not a fan of how slow this laptop works, but I'm sure you guys have noticed that my webcam video was not the most clear anyway. So anyway, I just am really enjoying the fact that there are some just absolutely a million social commentary in this book. Something that I'm really enjoyed about it. Plus a lot of little moments where they made like just random jokes that like you almost feel immature laughing at. Like how Charlie Bates goes by Master, or all the way up to like the less obvious stuff that I'm not trying to. Gosh, come on, computer. This is absolutely ridiculous. I'm just trying to find Jamie Tomalin. He keeps showing up, and that's dope. Oh boy. One more time with this. This is probably going to end up being a lot more clean when Chris the Fresh gets his hands on it. But consciousness, comedy, literature, learning, hashtag Shaggy Writes. I think that's quite brilliant. Quite brilliant indeed. But we really are in a process of attempting to at least maintain a high level of consciousness by utilizing this time in quarantine to learn as much as possible instead of just sit around and play games. Okay, I'm gonna go back and try and do this again after, because this still hasn't even pulled up the initial page of results, and that is just nuts to me. And I'm not trying to torture everybody, even though I want to get so I want to subscribe to Jamie real quick for being awesome. So again, this is sub for sub. Anyone who shows up, just let me know and I will sub back. Got about 6 pages left in the chapter. I'm going to blow through it all in one sitting. So try not to be too mad if you're looking to spam my chat, because I'm always looking for spam.
Have you shot anything particular lately, Giles?
Inquired the doctor when he had concluded.
Nothing particular, sir,
reported Mr. Giles, coloring up the eyes.
"Nor catching any thieves or identifying any housebreakers," said the doctor. None at all, sir," said Mr. Giles with much gravity. "Well," said the doctor, "I'm sorry to hear it, because you do that sort of thing so admirably. Pray, how is Brittles?" "The boy is very well, sir," said Mr. Giles, recovering his usual tone of patronage. "He sends his respectful duty, sir." "Not well," said the doctor, "seeing you here among Mr. Giles. But on the day before, when I was Butch, I was called away so hurriedly and executed, at the request of your good mistress, a small commission in your favour. Just step into this corner for a moment, will you?" Mr. Giles walked into the corner with much importance and some wonder, and was honoured with a short whispering conference with the doctor, on termination of which he made a great many bows and retired with the steps of unusual stateliness. The subject matter of this conference was not disclosed in the parlour, but the kitchen was speedily enlightened concerning it, for Mr. Giles walked straight thither, and having called for a mug of ale, announced, with an air of majesty, which was highly effective, that it had pleased his mistress, in consideration of his gallant behaviour on the occasion of that attempted robbery, to deposit in the local savings bank the sum of £25 for his sole use and benefit. At this the two women servants lifted up their heads and eyes, and supposed that Mr. Giles would begin to be quite proud now. Whereunto Mr. Giles, pulling out his shirt frill, replied, "No, no," and that if they observed that he was at all haughty to his inferiors, he would thank them to tell him so. And then he made a great many other remarks, no less illustrative to his humility, which were received with equal favour and applause. Excuse me. And were withal as original and as much to the purpose as the remarks of great men commonly are. Above the stairs the remainder of the evening passed cheerfully away, for the doctor was in high spirits, and however fatigued or thoughtful Harry Maylie might have been at first, he was not proof against the worthy gentleman's good humour, which displayed itself in a great variety of sallies and professional reflections, and an abundance of small jokes, which struck Oliver as being the drollest things he had ever heard, and caused him to laugh proportionately, to the evident satisfaction of the doctor, who laughed immoderately at himself, and made Harry laugh almost as heartily by the very force of sympathy. So they were as pleasant at a party as, under the circumstances, they could well have been, and it was late before they retired, and light and thankful hearts to take the rest of which, after the doubt and suspense they had recently undergone, stood so much in need. Oliver rose next morning in better heart, and went about his usual early occupations, with more help and pleasure than he had known for many days. The birds were once more hung out to sing in their old places, and the sweetest wild flowers that could be found were once more gathered to gladden Rose with their beauty and fragrance. The melancholy which had seemed to sad eyes of the anxious boy to hang for days past over every object, beautiful as all were, as dispelled by magic. The dew seemed to sprinkle more brightly on the green leaves, and the air to rustle among them with sweeter music, and the sky itself to look more blue and bright. Such is the influence which the condition of our own thoughts exercises even over the appearance of external objects. Men who look on nature and their fellow man, and cry that all is dark and gloomy, are in the right, but
The somber colors are reflections from their own jaundiced eyes and hearts. The real hues are delicate and need a clearer vision. It is worthy of remark that Oliver did not fail to note it at that time, that his morning expeditions were no longer made alone. Harry Maylie, after the very first morning when he met Oliver coming laden home, was seized with such a passion for flowers, and displayed such a taste in their arrangement, as he left his young companion far behind. If Oliver were behindhand in these respects, however, he knew where the best were to be found, and morning after morning they scoured the country together, and brought home the fairest of the blossom. The young win excuse me. The window of the young lady's chamber was open now, for she loved to feel the rich summer air stream in and revive her with its freshness. Sorry, sorry about that, Fishy. I just am having some weird technical difficulties today because apparently pulling up YouTube while you're making a YouTube video triggers it to automatically play your video, regardless of if you want to actually watch it or not at the moment. As he set forth on his morning's walk, pending these observations, the days were flying by, and Rose was rapidly recovering. Nor did Oliver's time hang heavy in his hands, although the young lady had not yet left her chamber, and there were no evening walks, save now and then for a short distance with Mrs. Maylie. He applied himself with redoubled absurdity to the instructions of the white-headed old gentleman, and labored so hard that his quick progress surprised even himself. It was while he was engaged in this pursuit that he was greatly startled and distressed by a most unexpected occurrence. The little room in which he had been accustomed to sit was busy at his books, was on the ground floor at the back of the house. It was a quiet little cottage room with a lattice window around which there were clusters of jasmine and honeysuckle that crept over the casement and filled the place with their delicious perfume. He looked into a garden whence a wicket gate that opened into a small padlock. All beyond was a fine meadowland of wood. There was no other dwelling near in that direction, and the prospect it commanded was very extensive. One beautiful evening, when the first shades of twilight were beginning to settle upon the earth, Oliver sat at his window, intent upon his books. He had been poring over them for some time, and as the day had been uncommonly sultry, he had exerted himself a great deal. It is no disparagement to the authors, whoever they may have been, to say that gradually and by slow degrees he fell asleep. There is a kind of sleep that steals upon us sometimes, which while it holds the body prisoner, does not free the mind from a sense of things about it, and enable it to ramble as it pleases. So far as the overpowering heaviness, a prostration of strength, and an utter inability to control our thoughts or powers of motion can be called sleep, that is it. And yet we have a consciousness of all that is going on about us. And if we dream at such a time, words which are really spoken or sounds which really exist at the moment accommodate themselves with surprising readiness to our visions until reality and imagination become so strangely blended that it is afterwards almost a matter of impossibility to separate the two. Nor is this the most striking phenomenon incidental to such a state. It is an undoubted fact that although our senses of touch and sight be for the time dead, yet our sleeping thoughts and visionary scenes passed before us will be influenced and materially influenced by the mere silent presence of some external object which may not have been near us when we closed our eyes, and of whose vicinity we have no waking consciousness. Oliver knew perfectly well that he was in his own little room, that his books were lying on the table before him, and that the sweet air was stirring among the creeping plants outside. And yet he was asleep. Suddenly the scene changed. The air became close and confined, and he thought with a glow of terror that he was in the Jew's house again. There sat the hideous old man in his accustomed corner, pointing to him and whispering to another man with a face averted who sat beside him.
Hush, my dear,
He thought as he heard the Jew say,
it is he, sure enough. Come away.
the other man seemed to answer.
Or could mistake him if, thank you, if a crowd of devils were to put themselves into his exact shape, and he stood amongst them, there is something that would tell me how to point him out. If you buried him 50 feet deep and took me across his grave, I should know if there wasn't a mark above that he lay buried there, I should.
The man seemed to say this with such dreadful hatred that Oliver awoke with fear and started up. Good heaven! What was that which sent the blood tingling to his heart and deprived him of his voice and the power to move? There at the window, so close before him, so close that he could have almost touched him before he started back, with his eyes peering into the room, and meeting his, stood the Jew. And beside him, white with rage or fear or both, were the scowling features of the very man who had accosted him at the inn yard. It was but an instant, a glance, a flash before his eyes, and they were gone, but they had recognized them, and he them, and their look was as firmly impressed upon his memory as if it had been deeply carved in stone and set before him from his birth. He stood transfixed for a moment, and then, leaping from the window into the garden, called loudly for help. Yep, Fagin and friends are showing boy. Ah, yes, and that is the end of 34. We are now on chapter 35, containing the unsatisfactory result of Oliver's adventure in a conversation of some importance between Harry Maylie and Rose. So thanks again to Fishy, Jamie Tomlin, anyone else who showed up, because I keep seeing that number click up and down, and that's really dope that there have been people this whole time. Now, for history fact, this one's going to be kind of interesting because there was only one female empress in Rome, in classical Rome, I should say, and her name was Ulpa Severina. She was the wife of Emperor Aurelian, and Emperor Aurelian was killed by a bunch of treacherous soldiers when he was leading them to basically like the last big fight that he would have to undertake if he hadn't been killed. They really just didn't even have a reason for it, because he was just widely regarded by just about everybody to have been like an excellent emperor. And when he died, there was like a whole, almost a year where officially on the books, the Senate and the armies could not agree on who they wanted to be the next emperor. So, in the midst of all this, Ulpia Severina, again, the late emperor's wife, who was in Rome when all this was going on, actually stepped up and proceeded to really help everyone get things back on track. helped pick out her own successor, and then abdicated peacefully. Um, so she really deserves some love, Ulpia Severina, because she was really just like one of those people who was a very capable diplomatic ruler, and she was um, also one of those few people who was magnanimous enough to actually know when her time was up and step aside for the people who she even felt deserved to be in power more than she did, which was really just awesome because you hear about these women in Roman history as being like these bad people, like Zenobia, the warrior queen who conquered the eastern half of the empire in the middle of the crisis, or Cleopatra who swayed Caesar and Mark Antony to her side, or um, even in their founding myth, they have a queen named Dido that was one of the original queens of Carthage, and when Aeneas rejected her, she killed herself and put a curse on Rome because that was yeah. So a lot of the people who wrote about Rome after the fact did not have a high opinion of the powerful women that were involved in the Republic, and basically wrote any good women out of the history books. So we don't know a whole lot about Ulpia Severina, but she served as emperor for almost a year just to keep the peace and stability. Um, Her husband put value back into Rome's currency, but that actually had left a little bit of a shortage. So what she did was minted more coins and put them out for the people to have because they were in the middle of this giant economic crisis before the family even took power. Um, so yeah, Severina might be a really dope name for a daughter if anyone got any kids coming up and wants somebody named after a queen, because that is definitely one of the dopest um, little stories I've heard in a long time. So, yeah, next time we will have another historical figure. And if you guys can think of anybody that you want to talk about, let me know in the chat. So, chapter 35, containing the unsatisfactory result of Oliver's adventure and a conversation of some importance between Harry Maylie and Rose. When the inmates of the house, attracted by Oliver's cries, hurried to the spot which they proceeded, they found him pale and agitated, pointing in the direction of the meadows behind the house, and scarcely able to articulate the words, "The Jew, the Jew." Mr. Giles was at a loss to comprehend what this outcry meant, but Harry Maylie, whose perceptions were something quicker, and who had heard Oliver's history from around the corner. "That," said Oliver, pointing the course of the men that had taken. "I missed them in an instant." "Then they are in the ditch," said Harry. "Follow, and keep as near me as you can." So saying, he sprung over the hedge and darted off with a speed which rendered him a matter of exceeding difficulty for the others to keep near him. Giles followed as well as he could, and Oliver followed too, and in the course of a minute or two Mr. Losberne, who had been out walking and just then returned, tumbled over the hedge after them, and picking himself up with more agility than he could have been supposed to possess, struck into the same course at no contemptible speed, shouting all the while most prodigiously to know what was the matter. On they all went, nor stopped they once to breathe, until the leader, striking off at an angle in the field indicated by Oliver, began to search narrowly the ditch and hedge adjoining, which afforded time for the remainder of the party to come up, and for Oliver to communicate to Mr. Losberne the circumstances that had led to so vigorous a pursuit. The search was all in vain. There were not even traces of the recent footsteps to be seen. They stood now on the summit of a little hill, commanding the open fields in every direction for 3 or 4 miles. There was a village in the hollow on the left, but in order to gain that, after pursuing the track Oliver had pointed out, the men must have made a circuit of open ground, which it was impossible they could have accomplished in such a short time. A thick wood skirted the meadow-land in another direction, but they could not have gained that covert for the same reason. "It must have been a dream, Oliver," said Harry Maylie. "Oh, no, indeed, sir," replied Oliver, shuddering at the very recollection of the old wretch's countenance. "I saw him too plainly for that. I saw them both, as plainly as I see you now." "Who was the other?" inquired Harry and Mr. Losberne together. "The very same man I told you of, who so suddenly upon me in the inn," said Oliver. "We had our eyes fixed full upon each other, and I could swear to him." "He took this way?" demanded Harry. "Are you sure?" "As I am that the men were at the window," replied Oliver, pointing down as he spoke to the hedge which divided the cottage garden from the meadow. "The tall man leaped over just there, and the Jew, running a few paces to the right, crept through that gate." The two gentlemen watched Oliver's earnest face as he spoke, and, looking from him to each other, seemed to feel satisfied of the accuracy of what he said. Still, in no direction were any of the appearances of the trampling of men in hurried flight. The grass was long, but it was trodden down nowhere, save where their own feet had crushed it. The sides and bricks of the ditches were of damp clay, but in no one place could they discern the print of men's shoes or the slightest mark which would indicate that any feet had pressed the ground for hours before. "Oh, excuse me. This is strange," said Harry.
Strange,
Echoed the doctor.
Blathers and Duff themselves could make nothing of it.
Notwithstanding the evidently useless nature of their search, they did not desist until the coming on of night rendered its further persecution hopeless, and even then they gave up with reluctance. Giles was dispatched to different ale-houses in the village, furnished with his best description Oliver could give of the appearance and dress of the strangers. Of these the Jew was, in all events, sufficiently remarkable to be remembered. Supposing he had been seen drinking or loitering about, but had returned without any intelligence, calculated to dispel or lessen the misery. On the next day, further search was made, and the inquiries renewed, but with no better success. On the following day, Oliver and Mr. Maylie repaired to the market town, in the hope of seeing or hearing something of the men there, but this effort was equally fruitless, and after a few days the affair began to be forgotten, as most affairs are, when wonder, having no fresh food to support it, dies away of itself. Meanwhile Rose was rapidly recovering. She had left her room, was able to go out, and mixing once more with the family carried joy into the hearts of all. But although this happy change had visible effect on the little circle, and although cheerful voices and merry laughter were once more heard in the cottage, there was at times a halt not unknown to you, though from your lips you have not yet heard them stated. Rose had been very pale from the moment of his entrance, but that might have been the effect of her recent illness. She merely bowed, and bending over some plants that stood near, waited in silence for him to proceed. "I I ought to have left here before," said Harry. "Oh, you should indeed," replied Rose. "Forgive me for saying so, but I wish you had." "I was brought here by the most dreadful and agonizing of all apprehensions," said the young man, "the fear of losing one dear being on whom my every wish and hope are fixed. You had been dying, trembling between earth and heaven. We know that when the young, the beautiful, and good are visited with sickness, their pure spirits insensibly torn towards their bright home of lasting rest. We know, heaven help us, that the best and fairest of our kind too often fade in blooming. There were tears in the eyes of the gentle girl as these words were spoken, and when one fell upon the flower over which she was bent, and glistened brightly in its cup, making it more beautiful, it seemed as though the outpouring of her fresh young heart claimed kindred with the loveliest things in nature. "An angel," continued the young man passionately. "The creature is fair and innocent of guile as one of God's own angels, fluttered between life and death. Oh, who could hope, when the distant world to which she was akin half opened to her view, that she would return to the sorrow and calamity of this? Rose, Rose, to know that you were passing away like some soft shadow which a light from above casts upon the earth, like some to have no hope that you would be spared to those who linger here, to know no reason why you should be, to feel that you belong to that bright sphere whither so many of the fairest, best have winged their early flight, and yet to pray amid all these consolations that you might be restored to those who love you. These were the distractions almost too great to bear. They were mine by day and night, and with them came such a rushing torrent of fears and apprehensions and selfish regrets lest you die. Never know how devotedly I love you, as almost bore down upon sense and reason. Oh, excuse me. As almost bore down upon sense and reason in its course. You recovered day by day, and almost hour by hour. Some drop of health came back, and mingled with the spent and feeble stream of life, which circulated languidly within you, swelled it again to high and rushing tide. I have watched you changed almost from life to death, with eyes that moistened with their eagerness and deep affection. Do not tell me that you wish I had lost this, for it has softened my heart to all mankind. Oh boy. Glad to see you're still here, Fishy. Sorry I'm not responding super quick. I'm trying to keep the breaks minimal. Um, I was told by my friend Against the World G the other day that the best thing I can do for this is to try and make it somewhat episodic and keep the breaks to a minimum. But they work really well for me as they do for everybody else too. So keeps me from going way overboard. And some of these voices really tear my throat up. I'm just glad I haven't had to do too much Bill Sykes in the last few chapters. I still hate Bill Sykes. Oh my goodness. Grr. Trying to check my phone. I'll be right back. Checking my phone. Checking my phone. Ugh. Okay. Johann Sebastian. He's back. Okay. Oh boy. Thanks so much for your patience, everybody. I did not mean that, said Rose, weeping. I only wish you had left here, that you might have turned to high and noble pursuits again, to pursuits well worthy of you.
Oh boy. There is no pursuit more worthy of me, more worthy of the highest nature that exists than the struggle to win hearts as yours, said the young man, taking her hand. Rose, my own dear Rose, for years and years I have loved you, hoping to win my way to fame and then come proudly home to tell you that it had been pursued only for you to share, thinking in my daydreams how I would remind you in that happy moment of many silent tokens I have given of a boy's attachment, and claim your hand as in redemption of some old mute contract that had been sealed between us. That time has not arrived. Oh boy. Hi, Five Fingers. Glad to see you showing up. I will sub to you as soon as I get a moment. I was trying to keep this limited on the breaks, but keep losing my place and my phone keeps going off. So between the two things there, it's kind of ridiculous. And yes, Fishy, I see you. I'm glad you're here. And if you have any questions or you want to say anything, just say it, man. I will respond eventually. Um, because one love, everybody. I hope y'all are doing great today. So, that time has not arrived, but here with no fame won, and no young vision realized, I give to you the heart so long your own, and stake all mine upon the words with which you greet the offer.
Your behavior has been kind and noble,
Said Rose, mastering the emotions by which she was agitated.
is you believe that I am not insensible or ungrateful. So hear my answer.
It is that I may endeavor to deserve you. It is, dear Rose.
It is
Replied Rose.
that you must endeavor to forget me, not as your old and dearly attached companion, for that would wound me deeply, but as the object of your love. Look into the world and think how many hearts you would be proud to gain there. Confine some other passion to me if you will, and I will be the truest, warmest, most faithful friend you have.
There was a pause big pause, during which Rose had covered her face with one hand, gave free to vent to her tears. Harry still retained the other. And your reasons, Rose, he said at length in a low voice, your reasons for this decision.
You have a right to know them,
Rejoined Rose.
you can say nothing to alter my resolution. It is a duty that I must perform. I owe it alike to others and to myself.
To yourself.
Yes, Harry, I owe it to myself that I, a friendless, portionless girl, with a blight upon my name, should not give your friends reason to suspect that I had sordidly yielded for your first passion, and fastened myself a clog on all your hopes and projects. I owe it to you and yours to prevent you from opposing, in the warmth of your generous nature, this great obstacle to your progress in the world.
If your inclinations chime with your sense of duty, Harry began.
They do not.
Replied Rose, coloring deeply. Then you return my love, said Harry. But say that, dear Rose, say but that, and soften the bitterness of this hard disappointment. Hang on 2 seconds. Five fingers. I'm sorry, give me a minute to load anything. And Fishy, I will give you a mod. But don't just go blocking everybody. I don't think it's wrong for someone to express themselves if they're feeling in a bad mood. And don't abuse your power, okay? You are now a mod.
If I could not have doing a heavy wrong to him I loved,
rejoined Rose,
I could
have received this declaration very differently, said Harry. Do not conceal that from me at least, Rose.
I could,
said Rose.
Stay,
she added, disengaging her hand.
Why should we prolong this painful interview, most painful to me and yet productive of the lasting happiness notwithstanding? For it will be happiness to know that I once held the high place in your regard which I now occupy, and every triumph you achieve in life will animate me with new fortitude and firmness. Farewell, Harry, as we have met today. We meet no more, but in other relations than those which this conversation would have placed us. May we be long and happily intertwined, and may every blessing that the prayers of a true and earnest heart call down from the source of all truth and sincerity cheer and prosper you.
Another word, Rose, said Harry. Your reason in your own words from your own lips. Let me hear it.
The prospect before you,
answered Rose formally,
is a brilliant one. All the honors to which great talents and powerful connections can help the men in public life are in store for you. But those connections are proud, and I will neither mingle with such as hold in scorn the mother who gave me life, nor bring disgrace and failure on the son of her who has well supplied that mother's place. In a word,
said the young lady, turning away as her temporary firmness forsook her,
there is a stain upon my name which the world visits on innocent heads. I will carry it no blood but my own, and the reproach shall rest.
Word, Rose, dearest Rose, one more, cried Harry, throwing himself before her. If I had been less fortunate, the world would call it, if by some obscure and peaceful life had been my destiny, if I had been poor, sick, helpless, would you have turned from me then, or has my probable advancement to riches and honor given this scruple birth?
Do not press me to reply,
answered Rose.
The question does not arise and never will. It is unfair, unkind to urge it.
If your answer be what I almost dare to hope it is, retorted Harry, it will shed a gleam of happiness upon my lonely way, and light the dreary path before me. It is not an idle thing to do so much by the utterance of a few brief words for one who loves you beyond all else. Oh, Rose, in the name of my ardent and enduring attachment, in the name of all I have suffered for you, and all you doom me to undergo, answer me this one question.
Then, if your lot had been differently cast,
rejoined Rose,
if you had been even a little, but not so far above me, I could have been a help and comfort to you in some humble scene of peace and retirement, not a blot and drawback in ambitious and distinguished crowds. I should not have spared this trial. I have every reason to be happy, very happy now. But then, Harry, I own I should have been happier.
Busy recollections of old hopes cherished as a girl long ago crowded into the mind of Rose while making this avowal. avowal. But they brought tears with them, as hopes will when they come back with as hopes will when they come back withered, and they relieved her.
I cannot help this weakness, and it makes my purpose stronger, said Rose, extending her hand. I must leave you now, indeed.
I ask one promise, said Harry, once and only once more. Say within a year, but it may be much sooner. Let me speak to you again on this subject for the last time.
Not to press me to alter my right determination,
replied Rose with a melancholy smile.
It would be useless.
No, said Harry, to hear you repeat it, if you will finally repeat it, I will lay at your feet whatever situation of fortune I may possess, and if you still adhere to your present resolution, will not seek by word or act to change it.
Let it be so, rejoined Rose. It is but one pang more, and by the time I may be enabled to hear it better.
She extended her hand again, but the young man caught her this time. But the young man caught her to his bosom, and imprinting one kiss on her beautiful forehead, hurried from the room. Oh, I almost died at the very end there. Still don't know what I did to upset Five Fingers there, but as long as you don't have anything to say to my face, we're cool. Fishy, I thought I just assigned you a mod, but nothing changed, so let me try it one more time. And we shall see. Okay, yeah, it says you're a mod now. It just didn't come up any differently, so I don't know what's going on with that. Five Fingers, my internet sucks. So not even my internet. I think it's just this laptop webcam that sucks. So it slows everything down, makes it really hard for me to get in touch with people right away. So if you want me to sub to you, sub to me. Really simple. I've already got to go look up Jamie Tomalin. Just because I'm not 100% sure if it's Tomlin or not. But anyway, we're doing little history tidbits in between today. So, one of my favorite historical figures of all time is Mansa Musa Keita. Mansa Musa Keita, the Emperor of Mali. He took over for his uncle when his uncle was, who actually his uncle really deserves some props too. But Abu Bakari was Mansa Musa's uncle. He built up a fleet of, I want to say it was 1,000 ships to sail across the Atlantic Ocean and explore new continents that they'd heard about. It's one of those things that we don't really see a whole lot of history about because there seems to be like a political alignment there for people in other countries. They don't want to say that anyone other than the people that the modern nobility is descended from discovered anything. But in like I think it was 1310, or no, it was 1307 actually. Abu Bakari left his nephew Mansa Musa in charge. When he was unable to come back, Mansa Musa took full power and immediately started conquering cities. Most of them were different trade rivals, people that were actually posing a threat to the stability of Mali. Over the course of like about another 10 or 15 years, he became the single most powerful emperor
in the history of West Africa that we know of. In that amount of time, he had actually managed to take uh, three new gold mines into his kingdom, and they'd already had one of the most massive gold mines on earth in their kingdom at the time. So, well, Mansa Musa, being a devout Muslim at the time, he decided that this was a good excuse to go on a Hajj. But instead of just going on a regular Hajj and just taking the trip from Mali across North Africa and into Mecca and Medina like a regular Muslim would, he decided on doing things a little bit differently. He brought thousands of people, each of them carrying like 40, 50 pounds of gold the whole way. A wagon train that literally took a whole day to pass through any given town, just because there were so many camels and horses and different animals all carrying gold dust and provisions for the thousands and thousands of soldiers he was marching with. Um, People would come up and just beg him for a couple dollars, and like go from completely being broke, homeless, destitute, having just like a whole handful of gold dust dropped in their outstretched palms. Like he would just reach into his bag and whew, you're an instant millionaire. People who were literally starving became millionaires in like 10 seconds just because one guy could do that. He would just reach into his bag and give you a whole handful of gold dust back when it was highly valued. Uh, when he got into Cairo, he absolutely loved all of the classical statues, art, architecture, the Egyptian culture, the Greek culture, the Roman culture that had all kind of fused in to that Egypt of the time. And by trading for so many different little treasures and knickknacks and things that he could add to his libraries back in Mali, he accidentally caused a gigantic a gigantic economic collapse because the price of gold went so far down that it completely upended society as they knew it. And Mansa Musa's only course of action was to buy back all of his gold with interest. And he accidentally ended up being responsible for all trade of all the gold in the Mediterranean region. And the accidental crisis that he caused still lasted a full 12 years. The guy in charge of Egypt absolutely hated him because here was a guy that really didn't think that was the king of an even more powerful kingdom and didn't have any need to come see this guy or bow before his feet. But he was still happy to give him presents and tell him that he was happy to be there. And then to top everything off, Mansa Musa ended up making his Hajj with a couple side trips, just like all across the Mediterranean and the Levant. He ended up making his Hajj, and when he made his Hajj, he bought so many houses that there are still houses that exist along the Hajj route today. Um, Keeping in mind that this was happening in the 1320s, there are still houses on the Hajj route today that belong to Mansa Musa officially, that he just left there to let people sleep in because he could. And then the wildest part of all of that is that while he was gone, the single most important city um, in the region that had not been under control of his empire was conquered by his top general and his son, with the vast majority of the empire's riches in this gigantic wagon train that he was taking with him everywhere. We're talking about someone who takes 20,000 soldiers with them somewhere and then still has the ability to conquer Timbuktu and Gao and couple other cities as well in the year and a half that he's gone. And the weirdest part about it, he was so confident that they were going to succeed that Mansa Musa had already designed his college that he wanted at Timbuktu and used his Hajj trip as a means of recruiting scholars to come and work for him with his universities and work for him with his new university and his library in Timbuktu. Mansa Musa ended up actually fortifying Timbuktu really well when it was almost invaded after he came back a few years later in, I think, 1530. And accidentally gave the future Songhai rulers a really great place to launch their invasions from because Timbuktu became basically impenetrable. Um, but it is just absolutely mind boggling because if you were to combine John Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, J.P. Morgan, Jeff Bezos, and Bill Gates all together, they still don't have nearly as much wealth as Mansa Musa did. Mansa Musa could have literally bought your whole hands down, no questions asked. And that includes America. He was basically single handedly the GDP of America for like 20, 30 plus years at one point. Um, and even if you just break down his resources and just say that, okay, even if we translate everything into modern standards and just go entirely off of his resources, he's still worth almost $1 trillion with a T. Literally, only one family has ever been richer than that man, and it was the whole family, not just one individual member of that family. So Mansa Musa, single richest man in history. Ulpa Severina, the only female Roman emperor. If y'all have any additional suggestions for more historical figures, drop them in the comments because we're doing history today. All part of the effort to raise your consciousness. That's give me 2 seconds. 2 seconds. Oh, Murphy. Oh, chapter 36 is a very short one and may appear of no great importance in its place, but it should be read notwithstanding as a
With great mystery, to start before the ladies are stirring, the consequence of which is that young Oliver is pinned down to his breakfast, digging in the matters after botanical phenomena of all kinds. But bad, isn't it, Oliver?
"I should have been very sorry not to have been home when you and Mr. Maylie went away, sir," rejoined Oliver.
That's a fine fellow, said the doctor. You shall come on and see me when you return. But to speak seriously, Harry, has any communication from the great Nob produced this sudden anxiety on your part to be gone?
"The great Nobs," replied Harry, "under which designation I presume you include my most stately uncle, have not communicated with me at all since I have not been here, nor, at this time of year, is it likely that anything would occur to render necessary my immediate attendance among them."
Well, said the doctor, you are a queer fellow, but of course they will get you into Parliament at the election before Christmas, and these sudden shiftings and changes are no bad preparation for the political life. There is something in that. Good training is always desirable, whether the race be for place, cup, or sweepstakes.
Harry Maylie looked as if he could have followed up the short dialogue by one or two remarks that would have staggered the doctor not a little, but he contented himself with saying, "We shall see," and pursued the subject no further. The post chassis drove up to the door shortly afterwards, and Giles coming in for the luggage, the good doctor bustled out to see it packed. Oliver, said Harry Maylie in a low voice, let me speak a word with you. Oliver walked into the window recess, to which Mr. Maylie beckoned him. Much surprised at the mixture of sadness and boisterous spirits which his whole behaviour displayed. How can you write well now? Oh my goodness, excuse me. Can you write well now? Said Harry, laying his hands upon his arm. I should hope so, sir, replied Oliver. I shall not be home again, perhaps for some time. I wish you would write to me, say once every fortnight, every alternate Monday, through the General Post Office in London. Will you? Oh, I certainly shall, sir, and I shall be proud to do it, exclaimed Oliver, greatly delighted with the commission. I should like to know how my mother and Miss Maylie are, said the young man, and you can fill up a sheet by telling me what walks you take and what you talk about, and whether they, I mean, seem quite happy and quite well. You understand me? Oh, quite, sir, quite, replied Oliver. I would rather you did not mention it to them, said Harry, hurrying over his words, because it might make my mother anxious to write me oftener, and that is a trouble and a worry to her. Let it be a secret between you and me, and mind you tell me everything. I depend upon you. Oliver, quite elated and honored by a sense of his importance, faithfully promised to be secret and explicit in his communication. Mr. Maylie took leave of him with the warm assurances of his regard and protection. The doctor was in the chaise. Giles, who it had been arranged should be left behind, held the door open with his hand, and the women servants were in the garden looking on. Harry cast one slight glance at the latticed window and jumped into the carriage. Drive on, he cried. Hard, fast, full gallop. Nothing short of flying will keep pace with me today. Halloa! Cried the doctor, letting down the front glass in a rear, letting down the front glass in a great hurry, and shouting to the postilion. Something very short of flying will keep pace with me, do you? Jingling and clattering till distance rendered its noise inaudible and its rapid progress only perceptible to the eye. The vehicle wound its way along the road, almost hidden in a cloud of dust, now wholly disappearing, and now becoming visible again as intervening objects or intricacies of the way permitted. It was not until even the dusty cloud was no longer to be seen that the gazers dispersed. And there was one looker on who remained with eyes fixed upon the spot where the carriage had been disappeared, long after it was many miles away, for behind the white curtain which had shrouded her from view when Harry raised his eyes towards the window, sat Rose herself. He seems in high spirits and happy, she said at length. I feared for a time it might be otherwise. I was mistaken. I'm very, very glad. Tears of gladness as well as grief, but those which caroused down Rose's face as she sat pensively at the window, still gazing in the same direction, seemed to tell more of sorrow than of joy. Oh boy. 2 seconds. I'm actually at the very end of that chapter. He wasn't kidding when he said it was short. So the next one is chapter 37, to which the reader may perceive a contrast not uncommon in most matrimonial cases. Uh, I guess I should read that chapter. So let's go to one more historical fact before I do, because this is straight up ridiculous. I am hurting myself with these doggone voices. But it's great. I'm just glad everyone's having fun. Like I said, this whole time, I'm really grateful to have viewers when I'm doing these, or I probably would have quit by now. But they've definitely been getting a lot of views. Um, so, to those of you who aren't aware, today is 4/16/2020, or Faux Day, as it were. So, to any of my foes who might be watching, happy Faux Day. You can't get enough foes than faux foes in the date. One at the beginning, four in the day, and one more at the end. Oh boy, give me 2 seconds to stretch. Everything is on fire. Ah, one more time. One more. Okay, come on. Ah. Ooh. Ooh, pins and needles, pins and needles. I don't know how I'm gonna get through the next chapter. Oh boy. Ooh, remember hashtag Shaggy Writes. Consciousness, literature, learning, and comedy. Hashtag Shaggy Writes. Oh boy. Okay. So I still didn't get any suggestions though for any new historical characters. So I guess we're gonna go with classical Greece. The greatest supervillain of all time was a guy named Alcibiades. Um, Alcibiades was one of those people who everyone really just admired for the fact that he actually was decent looking. And that is literally like the one thing that every friggin' historical account of this man had in common was they would sit there and brag about how handsome he is for some reason. And we're talking about a guy who's been dead for thousands of years, but every friggin' historian talks about how handsome he is. It's creepy. It is what it is. I don't care. But it does play into the story because he basically managed to finagle his way with every single politician in Athens. Um, he actually, at one point, slept with the guy's wife. And then, when the guy confronted him about it, Alcibiades convinced him to not only let him go lay with his firstborn daughter and then tip it off. Hey, why not have one of my houses too, Alcibiades? Oh my God. And then, of course, there was all this shit's going on. So at one point, they have this ally in Sicily, which, it's that little ball at the bottom of the boot in Italy. Um, it looks like a boot kick in a soccer ball, and the soccer ball is Sicily. But Augusta was on one side of Sicily, and they were really worried because their bigger neighbor, who was allied with Sparta, um, Syracuse, was going to come in and wreck up their shop and prevent them from doing business on the island. So they cried out. So they sent out to Athens for help. Um, Alcibiades was the only one that was really for a gigantic military invasion of um, what was this? The only one there for this gigantic military invasion of Sicily, because back then it was a huge deal to transport, that many people needed to actually pull off an invasion to an island that was like literally, a couple thousand miles away. They somehow managed body, except for one guy named Nicias, to go on this adventure. And then right before it goes, someone went and defaced a whole bunch of these statues that were supposed to bring travelers good luck. So, in the dumbest move ever, they let everyone go and then tried to recall Alcibiades right when the military campaign was starting on the island. and left the army in charge of the one guy who didn't want to be there in the first place, Nicias. And of course, while he's sailing back to friggin' Athens, Alcibiades just sat in his little ship and just kept drifting a little further back, a little further back from the ships that escorted him. And then, as soon as he got far enough away that they couldn't catch him anymore, he turned tail and went to Sparta and sold them all of Athens' military secrets. And then got kicked out of Sparta 3 years later because, wait for it, not only was he screwing the Spartan queen, but when she had a kid, they all basically said the same thing about how much it looked like Alcibiades. So he went to Persia and told them all of Sparta and Athens' military secrets. And then a few years later, got kicked out probably for screwing too much there too, and went right back into Athens and overthrew their government just so that way he wouldn't have to go on trial for all the crazy, terrible things he did to them. Um, and I guess he finally ended up being a really celebrated military commander for Athens after all the craziness was said and done. Led him in a few big battles, uh, left one stupid guy in charge and ended up losing the whole battle because of the one guy being a dummy. Then he actually ended up having a whole bunch of assassins come to his house when he was going on 80. This seems to be a theme in ancient Greece. They kill people who are already older than dirt just for the sake of doing it. Um, and yeah, he basically killed like 5 or 6 people as a 70-something-year-old man, hopped out of his window, and then had to confront a whole bunch of archers on rooftops, which does not work out too well for a guy sitting on the ground with a knife. So, yeah, we have now discussed Ulpia Severina, Alcibiades, and Mansa Musa. I'm sure we'll come up with another historic character, but diving back in, Chapter 37, in which the reader may perceive a contrast not uncommon in matrimonial cases. Mr. Bumble sat in the workhouse parlor with his eyes moodily fixed on the cheerless gate, whence, as it was summertime, no brighter gleam proceeded than the reflection of sickly rays of the sun, which were sent back from its cold and shining surface. A paper fly cage dangling from the ceiling, to which he occasionally raised his eyes in gloomy thought. And as the heedless insects hovered round the gaudy network, Mr. Bumble heaved a deep sigh, while a more gloomy shadow overspread his countenance. Mr. Bumble was meditating, and it might be that the insects brought to mind some painful passage in his own life. Nor was Mr. Bumble's gloom the only thing calculated to awaken a pleasant melancholy in the bosom of the spectator. There were not waiting other appearances, and those closely connected with his own person, which announced that a great change had taken place in the position of his affairs. The laced coat and the cocked hat, where were they? He still wore knee breeches and dark cotton stockings on the nether limbs, but they were not the breeches.
Is there enough I paid for you, Lord above knows that?
Mr. Bumble turned and encountered the face of his interesting consort, who, imperfectly comprehending the few words she had overheard of his complaint, had hazarded the foregoing remark at a venture.
Mrs. Bumble, ma'am,
cried Mr. Bumble with sentimental sternness.
Well,
cried the lady.
have the goodness to look at me,
said Mr. Bumble, fixing his eyes upon her.
It stands such an eye as that,
said Mr. Bumble to himself.
She can stand anything. It is an eye. I never knew the fairy bubbles, and if it fails with her.
Oh my god, I keep going back to the doctor voice. What is wrong with me?
If she stands the eye as that,
said Mr. Bumble to himself, she can stand anything.
If it is at I never know to fail with poppers, and if it fails with her, my power is gone. Whether an exceedingly small expansion of eye to be sufficient to quell paupers, who, being lightly fed, are in no high condition, or whether the late Mrs. Corney was particularly proof against eagle glances, are matters of opinion. The matter of the fact is that the matron was in no way overpowered by Mr. Bumble's scowl, but on the contrary treated it with great disdain, and even raised a laugh thereat which sounded as though it were genuine. Upon hearing this most unexpected sound, Mr. Bumble looked first incredulous and afterwards amazed. He then relapsed into his former state, nor did he rouse himself until his attention was again awakened by the voice of his partner.
Are you going to sit there snoring all day?
Inquired Mrs. Bumble. Rejoined the Bumble. And although I was not snoring, I shall snore, gape, sneeze, laugh, or cry as the humour strikes me, such being my prerogative.
Your prerogative?
Sneered Mrs. Bumble with ineffable contempt. I said your word, mum, observed Mr. Bumble. The prerogative of a man is to command.
And what's the prerogative of the woman in the name of goodness?
Cried the relict of Mr. Crony deceased.
To obey, mum,
Thundered Mr. Bumble.
your late unfortunate husband should have taught it you, and then perhaps it might have been alive now. I wish he was, poor man.
Mrs. Bumble, seeing at a glance that the decisive moment had now arrived, and that a blow struck for the mattership on one side or another must be necessarily final and conclusive, no sooner no sooner heard this allusion to the dead and gone than she dropped into a chair, and with a loud scream that Mr. Bumble was a hard-headed brute, fell into a paroxysm of tears. But tears were not the things to find their way to Mr. Bumble's soul. His heart was waterproof. Like washable beaver hats that improve with the rain, his nerves were rendered stouter and more vigorous by the showers of tears, which being tokens of weakness, and so far tacit administration, and so far tacit, excuse me, and so far tacit admissions of his own power pleased and exalted him. He eyed his good lady with looks of great satisfaction, and begged, in an encouraging manner, that she should cry her hardest, and the exercise being looked upon by the faculty as strongly conductive to health. Oh boy, 2 seconds. Try and stretch here. Okay.
It opens the lungs, washes the countenance, exercises the eyes, and softens down the temper,
said Mr. Bumble.
So cry away.
As he discharged himself of this pleasantry, Mr. Bumble took his hat from a peg, and putting it on rather rakishly on one side as a man might, who felt he had asserted his superiority in becoming manner, thrust his hands into his pockets, and sauntered towards the door with as much ease and waggishness depicted in his whole appearance. Now Mrs. Corney that was had tired the tears because they were less troublesome than a manual assault, but she was quite prepared to make trial of the latter mode proceeding, as Mr. Bumble was not long in discovering. The first proof he experienced of the fact was conveyed in a hollow sound immediately succeeded by the sudden flying off of his hat to the opposite end of the room. This preliminary proceeding laying bare his head, the expert lady, clasping him tight round the throat with one hand, inflicted a shower of blows, dealt with the singular vigor and dexterity upon it with the other. This done, she created a little variety by scratching his face and tearing his hair off,
and having by this time inflicted as much punishment as she deemed necessary for the offense, she pushed him over a chair, which was luckily well situated for the purpose, and defied him to talk about his prerogative again, if he dared.
Get up,
Said Mrs. Bumble in a voice of command.
and take yourself away from here, unless you want me to do something desperate.
Mr. Bumble rose with very rueful countenance, wondering much that something desperate might be, and picking up his hat looked towards the door.
Are you going?
Demanded Mrs. Bumble.
Certainly, my dear.
Rejoined Mr. Bumble, making a quicker motion towards the door.
I don't intend to. I'm going, my dear.
I don't intend to. I'm going, my dear. You so very violent as really I. At this instant, Mrs. Bumble stepped hastily forward to replace the carpet which had been kicked up in the scuffle, and Mr. Bumble immediately darted out of the room without bestowing another thought on his unfinished sentence, leaving the late Mrs. Corney in full possession of the field. Mr. Bumble was fairly taken by surprise and fairly beaten. He had a decided propensity for bullying, derived no inconsiderable pleasure from the exercise of petty cruelty, and consequently was, it is needless to say, a coward. This is by no means a disparagement to his character, for many official personages who are held in high respect and admiration are the victims of similar infirmities. The remark is made indeed rather in his favor than otherwise, and with a view of impressing the reader with just sense of his qualifications for office. But the measure of his degradation was not yet full. After making a tour of the house and thinking for the first time that the poor laws really were too hard on people, and that men who ran away from their wives, leaving them chargeable to the parish, ought, in justice, to be visited with no punishment at all, but rather rewarded as meritorious individuals who had suffered much, Mr. Bumble came to a room where some of the female paupers were usually employed in washing the parish linen, and whence the sound of voices and conversation now proceeded. "Ahem," said Mr. Bumble, summoning up his naive dignity.
These women at last appear to respect the prerogative. Hello, hello there. What do you mean by this noise, you hussies?
With these words, Mr. Bumble opened the door and walked in a very fierce and angry manner, which as once exchanged for a most humiliated and cowering air, as his eyes unexpectedly rested on the form of his lady wife.
My dear, my dear,
Said Mr. Bumble.
I didn't know you were here.
I didn't know I was here.
Repeated Mrs. Bumble.
What do you do here?
Oh, I thought we was talking rather too much to be doing their work properly, my dear.
Replied Mr. Bumble, glancing distractedly at a couple of old women at the wash tub, who were comparing notes of admiration to the workhouse master's humility.
You thought they was talking too much?
Said Mrs. Bumble.
What business is it of yours?
Oh, what, my dear?
Urged Mr. Bumble submissively.
What business is it of yours?
Demanded Mrs. Bumble again.
It is very true, your matronly, my dear,
Submitted Mr. Bumble.
but I thought you mightn't be in the way just then.
I'll tell you what, Mr. Bumble.
Returned his lady.
We don't want any of your interference. You're a great deal too fond of poking your nose into things that don't concern you, making everybody in the house laugh the moment your back is turned, making yourself look like a fool every hour of the day. Be off, come.
Mr. Bumble, seeing with excruciating feelings the delight of the two old paupers were tittering together most rapturously, hesitated for an instant. Mrs. Bumble, whose patience broke no delay, caught up a bowl of soap suds, and motioning him towards the door, ordered him instantly to depart, on pain of receiving the contents on his portly person. What could Mr. Bumble do? He looked dejectedly round and slunk away, and as he reached the door, the titterings of the paupers broke into a shrill chuckle of irrepressible delight. It wanted but this. He was degraded in their eyes. He had lost caste and situation before the very paupers. He had fallen from all height and pomp of beadleship to the lowest depth of the most snubbed henpeckery.
Oh, in 2 months,
Said Mr. Bumble, filled with dismal thoughts.
2 months, no more than 2 months ago, it was not my own master, but everyone else's, so far as the parochial workhouse was concerned. And now,
It was too much. Mr. Bumble boxed the ears of the boy who opened the gate for him, for he had reached the portal in his reverie, and walked distractedly into the street. He walked up one side and down the other until the exercise had abated the first person of his grief, and then the revulsion of feeling paused before one in a byway whose parlor he gathered from a hasty peep over the blinds was deserted, save one solitary customer. It began to rain heavily at that moment. This determined him. Mr. Bumble stepped in and ordered something to drink as he passed the bar, entered the apartment into which he had looked from the street. So the people who are still watching, because y'all are dope, here is Mr. Bumble being degraded in the eyes of the paupers. Although, honestly, in my opinion, I feel like his wife is actually too good looking for him anyway. So he was doing something right. Oh boy. The man who was seated there was tall and dark and wore a large cloak. He had the air of a stranger, and seemed by certain haggardness of his look, as well as by the dusty soles on his dress, to have travelled some distance. He eyed Popple. Bah! Brr. He eyed Bumble askance as he entered, but scarcely denied to nod his head in acknowledgment of the situation. Mr. Bumble had quite dignity enough for two, supposing even the stranger had been more familiar. So he drank his gin and water in silence, and read the paper with a great show of pomp and circumstance. So happened, however, as it will very often, when men fall into company under such circumstances, that Mr. Bumble felt every now and then a powerful inducement which he could not resist to steal a look at the stranger, and that whenever he did so, he withdrew his eyes in some confusion to find that the stranger was at the moment stealing a look at him. Mr. Bumble's awkwardness was enhanced by a very remarkable expression in the stranger's eye, which was keen and bright, but shadowed by a scowl of distrust and suspicion, unlike anything he had ever observed before, and most repulsive to behold. When they encountered each other's glance several times this way, the stranger, in a harsh, deep voice, broke silence.
"Were you looking at me?" he said, "when you peered in the window?"
not that I'm aware of, unless you're Mr. Fuck.
Oh, that's not a curse word. You've been putting in these little dashes that look like they're going to be curse words, and then it's not. Um,
Not unless not that I'm aware of, unless you're Mr.
Here Mr. Bumble stopped short, for he was curious to know the stranger's name, and thought his impatience he might supply the bank.
"I see you are not,"
Said the stranger in an expression of quiet sarcasm playing about his mouth.
or you would have known my name. You don't know it. I would recommend you not to inquire. I'm in there.
I'm in no harm, young man, observed Mr. Bumble majestically.
And have done nothing.
Said the stranger. Another silence succeeded this short dialogue, which was again broken by the stranger.
"I've seen you before, I think," said he. "You were differently dressed at that time,
and I only passed you in the street, but I should know it was you. You were a beetle here once, were you not?"
"What was?" said Mr. Bumble with some surprise. "Pro beetle?"
"Just so,"
rejoined the other, nodding his head.
"it was in that character I saw you. What are you now?"
"Master of the workhouse," rejoined Mr. Bumble slowly and impressively to check the undue familiarity that stranger might otherwise assume. "Master of the workhouse, young man."
"You not the same eye for your own interests that you always had, I doubt not,"
resumed the stranger, looking keenly into Mr. Bumble's eyes as he raised them in astonishment to this question.
"Don't scruple to answer freely, man. I know you pretty well, you see."
"I suppose a married man," replied Mr. Bumble, shading his eyes with his hand and surveying the stranger from head to foot in evident perplexity. "Not more averse than turning an honest penny with his hand than a single one. Parochial officers are not so well paid that they can afford to refuse any little extra fee when it comes to them in a civil and proper manner." The stranger smiled and nodded his head again, as much to say he had not mistaken his man, then rang the bell.
"Feel this glass again,"
he said, handing Mr. Bumble's empty tumbler to the landlord.
"Let it be strong, you not. You like it so, I suppose."
"You're too strong," replied Mr. Bumble with a delicate cough.
"You understand what that means, landlord?"
said the stranger dryly. The host smiled and disappeared, and shortly afterwards returned with steaming jorum, of which the first gulp brought water into Mr. Bumble's eyes.
"Now listen to me,"
said the stranger after closing the door and window.
"I came down to this place today to find you out, and by one of those chances which the devil throws in the way of his friends sometimes, you walked into this very room I was sitting in, while you were uppermost in me mind. I want some information from you. I don't ask you to give it for nothing, short as it is. Put up that to begin with."
As he spoke, he pushed a couple of sovereigns across the table to his companion, carefully, unwilling to as though unwilling that the clinking of money should be heard without. When Mr. Bumble had scrupulously examined the coins to see if they were genuine, he put them up with much satisfaction in his waistcoat pocket and went up.
"Carry your memory back, you see, 12 years last winter."
"It's a young time," said Mr. Bumble. "Very good I've done it."
"You seen the workhouse?"
"Good."
"In your time, night?"
"Yes."
"And your place, the crazy old wherever it was, in which miserable crabs brought forth your life and health so often denied to themselves, gave birth to poor children for the parish to rear, and hidden their shame rot 'em in the grave."
"Your room, I suppose," said Mr. Bumble, not quite following the stranger's excited description.
"Yes," said the stranger, "a boy was born there."
"Many boys," observed Mr. Bumble, shaking his head despondently.
"A murrain of young devils," cried the stranger. "I speak of one, a meek-looking, pale-faced hound who was apprenticed down here to a coffin-maker. I wish he had made his coffin and screwed his body in it, and afterwards ran away to London, as was supposed."
"Why, you mean young Oliver Twist," said Mr. Bumble. "I remember him, of course. There wasn't the obstinate young rascal."
"It's not of him I want to hear. I've heard enough of him,"
said the stranger, stopping Mr. Bumble in the very outset of the tirade on the subject of poor Oliver's vices.
"It's of a woman, the hag that nursed his mother. Where is she?"
"Where is she?" said Mr. Bumble, with whom the gin and water had rendered facetious. It will be hard to tell. There's no midwifery there, this other place she's gone to, so I suppose she's out of employment anyway.
What do you mean?
Demanded the stranger sternly. She died last winter, rejoined Mr. Bumble. The man looked fixedly at him when he had given this information, and although he did not withdraw his eyes for some time afterwards, his gaze, gradually became vacant and abstracted, and he seemed lost in thought. For some time he appeared doubtful whether he ought to be relieved or disappointed by the intelligence, but at length he breathed more freely, and withdrawing his eyes, observed that it was no great matter. With that he rose as if to depart. Mr. Bumble was cunning enough, and he at once saw that an opportunity was opened for a lucrative disposal of some secret in the possession of his better half. He well remembered the night of old Sally's death, which the occurrences of that day had given him no good reason to recollect, and the occasion on which he had proposed to Mrs. Corney, and although that lady had never confided to him the disclosure of which she had been the solitary witness, he had heard enough to know that it was related to something that had occurred in the old woman's attendance as workhouse nurse upon the young mother of Oliver Twist. Hastily calling this circumstance into mind, he informed the stranger with an air of mystery that one woman had been closeted with the old harridan shortly before she died, and that she could, as he had reason to believe, throw some light onto the subject of his inquiry.
How can I find her?
Said the stranger, thrown off his guard and plainly showing that all his fears, whatever they were aroused afresh by the intelligence.
Only through me,
rejoined Mr. Bumble.
When?
Cried the stranger hastily.
Tomorrow,
rejoined Bumble.
At 9 in the evening,
said the stranger, producing a scrap of paper and writing down upon it an obscure address by the waterside in characters that betrayed his agitation.
At 9 in the evening, bring her to me there. I needn't tell you to be secret. It's your interest.
With these words, he led the way to the door after stopping to pay for the liquor that had been drunk, and shortly remarking that the roads were different, departed without more ceremony than an emphatic repetition of the hour of the appointment for the following night. On glancing at the address, the parochial functionary observed that it contained no name. The stranger had not gone far, so he made to ask.
Who's that?
Cried the man, turning round as Bumble touched him on the arm.
Following me?
Only to ask a question, said the other, pointing to the scrap of paper. What name am I to ask for?
Monks,
rejoined the man, and strode hastily away. And that leads us to chapter 38, containing an account of what passed between Mr. and Mrs. Bumble and Monks at their nocturnal interview. Ooh boy. Yeah. That's it for today. I can't do it anymore. I'm 2 hours and 2 minutes in, and much as I enjoy this, just sitting in one spot this long is not good for anybody. So once again, huge shout outs on Foe Day to all my foes, with a whole lot of extra love going in the direction of Against the World G and Chris the Fresh, who've been tuning into these pretty regularly. All kinds of love to my new mod Fishy. I guess I have to look up Jamie and Five Fingers here, just to see about doing a sub for their sakes. For anyone who is tuning in, just leave me a comment and tell me if you subbed, and I will come and do the same thing back for you. Please consider a like, a share, and a subscribe, hitting that bell button for notifications. We will be back tomorrow with chapter 28.
So, once again, thank you all very much. One love.